Good evening, and welcome to Explore the Tanya. Awaken your soul and take control. So, last week we discussed 5 different groups of people. The first 3 is a tzaddik, a righteous person, a rasha, a wicked person, and a beinoni, and the in between. And we learned within the tzaddik there are 2 types, which is tzaddik v'ralei and tzaddik v'tovlei. A tzaddik that is righteous and lives a great life, has it good for him in this world, and tzaddik v'ralei, and just the opposite. A righteous person, but he doesn't have it that great for him in this world. Life isn't hunky-dory for him, as they say. Then we have the other 2, rasha v'tovlei, rasha v'ralei, a wicked person that has it good for himself, and a wicked person that doesn't have it so great in life. And then we have the 5th one, a beinoni, the in-between person. The beinoni is in between, which we are really not sure what that means yet. So, at first glance, what we were talking about was, if you think about it, that a rasha v'tovlei and a rasha v'ralei, a rasha that has a good and a rasha that has it bad, at first glance, and a tzaddik v'tovlei, a tzaddik v'ralei, at first glance, that's all talking about the situation, his material situation in life. This world. We all know you have righteous people and they prosper. You have righteous people, unfortunately, they don't have it so great. And the same thing with the rasha, with a wicked person. But that's really just at first glance. As we're going to soon see, a rasha and a tzaddik is not necessarily what we mean. Right now, we're talking about their external situation in life. So I will continue with the words of Raya Mehemna. We're going to speak about the Zohar. The Zohar, there are many parts to the Zohar. And the Zohar, which is the foundation to Kabbalah, to Jewish mysticism, says as follows. Uveraya Mehemna Parshas Mishpatim. In the Raya Mehemna, and the part of the Zohar called Raya Mehemna, by the way, that was a part that was taught originally by Moshe Rabbeinu. Raya Mehemna is a part that was taught by Moshe Rabbeinu. Parshas Mishpatim, concerning the portion of Mishpatim on the Torah, Perish, it explains, Tzaddik v'ralei, a tzaddik, and it's not so good for him. What does that mean? It means Shahara Shabai, that the bad in him, Kofuf L'Toiv, the bad within him is suppressed by the good, which means he really is a tzaddik, he's a righteous person, but he still has some bad in him. It's just that the bad is overshadowed by the good. So wait a minute. According to this Zohar, we're not just talking about the life situation of a tzaddik or a rasha. We're talking about their internal character. It's not only tzaddik v'tovlei, a tzaddik, he has a good life. Tzaddik v'ralei, he has a bad life. Rasha v'tovlei, a rasha, a wicked person, a bad person, and he still has a good life. A rasha v'ralei, he has a bad life. It's not only dealing with his everyday life situation. Obviously, a tzaddik and a rasha, v'tovlei and v'ralei, is talking about more of their internal character, and that's according to the Zohar. Now, interesting enough, the Alter Rebbe, the Tanya, brings down another Gemara, and it says as follows. Of the Gemara and in the Talmud, Sof Perik Testa Brachas, the end of the 9th Perik in Tractate Brachot, it says as follows: Tzadikim Yetzer Tzov Shoftin. By righteous people, in the case of the tzaddikim, their impulse, their Yetzer Tov, their drives them to do good, their good inclination. Then it says Rishaim, wicked people, Yetzer Tov Shoftin. Their impulse to do evil, their Yetzer Hara, their internal drive is their evil inclination. Beinonim, but these in-betweeners are Beinoni, which is going to be the main character of our Tanya. The Beinoni, Zeh v'zeh Sholton. In the case of the people that are in between, both the good and bad impulses, the good and bad inclinations is what drives them. This tells us one thing. It just reinforces our opinion that a tzaddik and a rasha now is talking about their internal characters and their impulses, what drives them internally. We spoke about a tzaddik and a rasha. We hear what a tzaddik and a rasha is, but one of the hardest things to understand right now is a Beinoni. What is that exactly? We still don't know what that means. So Rabbah, who was one of the greatest sages of his generation at the time of the Talmud, Rabbah says, you want to know what a Beinoni is? You want to know what this in-between guy is? Now, remember, tzaddik, the righteous, the tzaddik is one extreme. The rasha is the other extreme. The Beinoni is right in the middle. Says Rabbah, do you want to know what it means, this Beinoni, what a Beinoni is? This in-betweener? Kegain ano Beinoni. He raises his hand, he says, pick me, I'm a Beinoni. This was Rabbah, one of the greatest sages, and he did not say that, believe me, Rabbah was a tzaddik. Rabbah was a very righteous person and only full of mitzvahs. And he's saying, I am a Beinoni. I'm in this middle category of people. I'm an in-betweener. Now, my friends, we have a little problem here. We can say maybe Rabbah, who was one of the greatest sages of his day, maybe he just meant to be, an anav, humility, a little humility, he said it. Doesn't make sense that he's saying this with humility. It's one thing you put yourself a little lower than you are, but to lie completely about yourself, that's not humility. That's called sheker. That's called a lie, a complete lie about yourself. So we don't understand how Rabbah, one of the greatest people, one of the greatest sages, can say he's a Beinoni. Amalei Abaye. So Abaye said to him, wait a minute. How are you calling yourself a Beinoni, this in-betweener? You're not letting us live. You're not giving us a chance. You're raising the bar. If you're a Beinoni and you're one of the greatest of the generation, who can be a tzaddik? We're all evil. Who can be a tzaddik then? You're not letting us live, says Abaye. Interesting enough. So evidently, right now, what is the difference between, as far as Rabbah is concerned, between a Beinoni and a tzaddik? It's not too big of a difference. So what is the difference, as the Tanya will say in just a few minutes? By the way, I'd like everyone to know that while we're learning Tanya, that was authored by the Alter Rebbe, it so happens tonight and tomorrow, the 24th day of the Hebrew month of Tevis, which begins tonight, is the yard site, the anniversary of the death of the author of the Tanya, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. On his yard site, we are learning his book that he authored. Ulahavin kol ze behed hetiv. Says the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, we have to understand all this with a little more clarity. Now, remember, I want to remind everyone of some of our questions that the Balatanya has asked. Number one is, I gave an oath. I had to take an oath before I came to this world. I had to take an oath that what? That I will be righteous and not wicked. Okay. How can I do that if the same time I have to look at myself? They tell me, look at yourself in your own eyes as a wicked person. How will I ever be able to do that? Number one, in other words, how will I be able to maintain a positive attitude in my service to God if I look down upon myself? If I look down upon myself, I'm not serving at all with joy. And not only that, that could bring me, as the Tanya said, to worse things. Number one question. Another question is, what is the real difference between a tzaddik, a rasha, and a beinoni? The Alter Rebbe is going to show us in the chapters to come that whatever we think is a tzaddik, whoever we think is a rasha, the way we look at a beinoni, the in-betweener, it's a whole different meaning. There's a much deeper meaning, which means when you go over to someone and you say to them, you're such a tzaddik, you're unbelievable, you're such a tzaddik. What you're basically telling them is, you're such a good guy, a nice guy. But on the level of a tzaddik, my friends, that person is not. And if you go, I'm sure no one here speaks about anyone else, but if by any chance, God forbid, you speak about anyone else and you say, that person is such a rasha, or she is so wicked, she's what we call a mashas. By the way, we don't understand what a rasha or a mashas means. We don't know what real wicked means according to the Balatanya. There's a much deeper meaning. And we definitely don't know the meaning of, and the next question is, we definitely don't know what a beinoni is. What is a beinoni so far? In between, what does that mean? Now we're going to see something very soon in between a tzaddik and a rasha. Now the classic interpretation we gave of a tzaddik and a rasha was the classic interpretation. Great. One is mostly mitzvos, and one is mostly averos, rasha. So imagine a person who has a majority, and a majority can mean 51% mitzvos. The classic interpretation is he's a tzaddik. Why? You go to a legal case, and you know what? He's not an innocent guy, but there's no evidence. He gets away with everything. He's a tzaddik. That means he got away with the law. He's innocent. And the same thing a rasha. He might be a great guy, but he couldn't prove himself. We consider him a rasha. According to the Balatanya, my friends, that is not a tzaddik or a rasha. And a beinoni, the classic interpretation would be, a beinoni, you got 50% good, 50% bad, and now let's see, if you do any good deeds, you'll be a tzaddik. Bad deeds, you'll be a rasha. But that doesn't make sense now either. Why? Because our great sage called Rabbi, the great sage Rabbi, he says, Kegainani beinoni, I am a beinoni? Wait a minute. Rabbi was a complete tzaddik. How can he consider himself a beinoni? Says the Balatanya a little further. The Alter Rebbe says as follows: Ulahavin kol zeh. And to understand all this, better hativ a little clearer, we have another question. Lahavin Masha Omar Iyov. We're going to quote now a Talmud, the tractate Baba Basra, in the first chapter. Eov, Job. We know Job suffered his whole life. He suffered terribly. Eov had complaints on God, believe it or not. And he started arguing with God. And he says as follows, Master of the world, Master of the universe, but also tzaddikim, you created tzaddikim. Also Rishoim, you created the wicked. So what right do you have to punish people, good or bad, if you created them? You decided if this one's gonna be wicked. You decided who's gonna be a tzaddik, who's gonna be a rasha. So what right, dear God, Master of the universe, what right do you have to punish anyone? Imagine, Job was arguing with the one and only God. Interesting enough, the Alter Rebbe says, this doesn't make sense either. Why? Because our rabbis tell us that yes, God decides who's going to be rich and who's going to be poor. God does decide who's going to be tall, who's going to be short. Yes, God decides who's going to be strong, who's going to be weak. But God does not decide, our rabbis tell us, who's going to be good and who's going to be bad. Say our rabbis, that's all in our hands. That's up to us. It's not decided in heaven. And here Eov, in the Gemara goes and argues with God. So what kind of argument is that? Says the Tanya. In other words, our rabbis tell us, Hakol bidei shamayim. Everything in life is in the hands of God. He decides, they decide in heaven when we're born, what's going to be our deck of cards. Chutz, except, say our rabbis, mi yiras shamayim, fearing God. Being good or being bad, good deeds and bad deeds, it's not preordained who's going to do good, who's going to do bad, who's going to be punished, who's going to be, have a great life. No. It's not preordained who's going to be good or bad. So how could, we have free will on that. So how could Eov, come and argue with God about that? Asked Alter Rebbe. And by the way, the Tanya, the author of the Tanya, answers that in chapter 14. Now we're going to have a brand new word, and this is a very important word. V'gam lahavin, and now we have to understand Mahus madregas habeinani. If you remember, when we started learning Tanya, we had a few titles for the Tanya. One was Tanya. The book is called Tanya. One is called Lekutei Amarim, an anthology, a collection of sayings of rabbis. And one was called, and this is the main thing that is called, Sefer Shel Beinanim, the book of in-betweeners. Now, we don't know yet what either of these mean, but now we're going to focus on the Beinani. Tanya is going to show us how everything is relevant. Judaism, Torah and mitzvos, Yiddishkeit is relevant to every single Jew. No matter what your spiritual status is, no matter what level of observance you're on, it doesn't matter. Tanya is relevant to all of us. And not only that, it's also personal. The Alter Rebbe is speaking to each one of us, my dear friends, personal. Meaning, each one of us, as I told you at the beginning, has our own custom-made life. and we each have our own trials and tribulations, our challenges. And the Alter Rebbe, besides telling us as a whole that Yiddishkeit, Judaism, is relevant to all of us, he's also telling us how each one of us can overcome and tackle our personal challenges. And not only that, we all have that gift given from God, the powers and the tools to overcome all of our challenges. So now the Alter Rebbe is going to say, wait a minute. The Gam Lahavin, we also have to understand and to have a real and strong understanding, Mahus Madregas Beinani. Mahus means, and this is a key word in Tanya, what is the essence, what is the core, what is the personality of this category of a person called a Beinani, an in-betweener? What does that mean? We saw already at Tzaddik and Rasha has to do with their internal character. So if we're talking about internally, the character, what is the character and personality of this Beinani? So we learned as a classic interpretation that a Beinani is 50-50, 50 good, 50 bad. You know, part Tzaddik, part Rasha. So the Balatanya says that can't be. It can't be 50-50. It's impossible. If that's the case, that it was 50-50, how could Rabbah say, be asmai on himself, Shehu Beinani? How can he count himself as a Beinani? He's no 50-50 type of guy. He's no 50-50 rabbi. I might be able to maybe say I'm 50-50, which I doubt that too. I'm a lot less than that. But for Rabbah, the greatest of the greatest, how can he say he's a Beinani if we're going to say a Beinani is 50-50? That's number one. V'noida lo pasei pumya megirsa at shafilu mal chamav shelehoyel yachol lishlei bay. We know that Rabbah did not stop. He constantly learned Torah, did mitzvos. He immersed himself in godliness his entire life, 24/7. So how can you say that such a person is a Beinani at 50-50? And if Rabbah, according to this, if Rabbah says he's a Beinani, must be a Beinani is something greater. Must be a Beinani is close to a tzaddik. So the Alter Rebbe is asking, the Balatanya is asking here, what is the mahus? What is the character, the personality? What makes this Beinani? What makes him tick? What makes a Beinani? What kind of character is he? What kind of challenges does he have? What kind of personality does he have? Asked the Alter Rebbe. How could Rabbah say this? So we have to understand one thing. And this is the key point to tonight's lesson, my dear friends. I want to explain one very important thing. If we're going to remain with a classic interpretations, a tzaddik is 50% good, a rasha is 50% bad, and a Beinani is 50-50, I got it. But we see that it's not. That's not the interpretation of a Beinani and a tzaddik and a rasha. The real interpretation and definitions are much deeper. It has to do with their character. It has to do with their personalities. It has to do with their trials and tribulations, which means, and this is the key point to tonight's lesson, what a person does and what a person actually is are two different things. When a person acts a certain way, it does not mean that deep inside his character is that way that he acts. You know, in English they say, don't judge a book by its cover. This is much deeper and a much more intense definition that don't judge a book by its cover. When we see a person acting a certain way, we are quick to say he is good or he is bad. He is kind, he is evil. He's a snob, he's miserable, he's angry. But do we really know what kind of character he has? Is that way that he acts actually mirroring his character, his essence, his core? Says the Alter Rebbe, and we're going to expand on this as we go on, that it's not true. It is not so. Not necessarily the way a person acts is the way he really is internally. In other words, and this is going to be one of the main themes of our Tanya, a person has so much internally that whatever we see externally is not necessarily the person. Not necessarily is that person the way he acts. Inside, the Alter Rebbe is going to say, the Balatanya, that every single Jew, every single one of us has a spark of godliness inside of them. It might be covered up. We might not see it, especially externally, how he acts. But every single Jew has that potential to reach a tremendous level of godliness. How? Because everyone is born with a spark of godliness, the Alter Rebbe is going to tell us. The Balatanya will tell us. Everyone has inside of them a spark. In Yiddish, we say many times, a pinta leyid. You know, it's very interesting. The Haggadah Shal Pesach. In the Haggadah, at the Seder, we say the Torah speaks about 4 sons. The Chacham, the wise son. The Rasha, the evil son. The rebellious. The Chacham, the Rasha. The Tam, the simple. And She'eni, the Elishal, and one who doesn't even know what to ask. You know what they all have in common? They're all at the Seder table. They're all at the Seder table. That itself shows how holy they are, even the Rasha. You want to know the potential of the Rasha? You're going to see that the Torah speaks about the 4 sons, and you're going to say, Echad Chacham, V'echad Rasha, V'echad Tam, V'echad Sheni Delishal. So first of all, you're going to see the Rasha, my friends, the wicked son, the rebel, is right near the Chacham, right near the wise son. This is an interesting concept. The Rasha comes right after the wise son. Shows us his potential. But the main point I'd like to bring out here with the 4 sons is, instead of saying a Chacham, a wise, and then it should say a rebel, a simpleton, and a one who doesn't know how to ask. Instead it says, one is a Rasha. One is this. One is that. Why one? Who is one referring to? There's only one. One is referring to God above, he's one. To tell us that each one of these sons have a piece of that one above. Every one of these sons, even the Rasha, even the rebel, even the one who comes to the Seder because my father's going to let me have it if I don't come. I feel guilty, and he has no interest. Even that one rebel, he still has that spark of God in him. So we're going to conclude now. And let's remember one thing, my dear friends. Let's not judge a book by its cover. We always say, it's greener on the other side. That guy has, and that guy's rich. I wish I was like him. We don't wish anything. Let's remember, we don't know what's going on inside someone else's life. We don't know what kind of characters people have. We don't know what's really making them tick. Why do they act a certain way? Why do they rebel? Why do they not come to shul? Why do they have the name? Why do we give them the name Rasha, evil, terrible? Why do we do that? Maybe there's a reason that they're acting the way they are, but deep inside, they're really not like that. Deep inside, they're really divine. They have that divine spark. And we will continue next week to discuss more questions, more about their characters, more about the personalities of the tzaddik, the Rasha, and the Beinani. I'd like to wish everyone a good night. Let's only hear good news. Take care. Be well.